Well, welcome again to Qdabra's weekly webinar for June 19th, 2014. Today, my name is Patrick Halstead. I did last week's webinar, and I'm doing again today. We have a list of tips, quick tips for you again. And you'll recall last week I did this and went through 5 tips here, how to and some gotchas, and did it. And this webinar is up on YouTube, so you can go to our Qdabra channel and you can take a look at last week's webinar if you didn't have the opportunity to see it last week in person. But today we've got a whole bunch of tips for you. And before I get started, I want to just tell you that today I'm actually using InfoPath instead of PowerPoint to present my slides. And here I've got an InfoPath form with some functionality. So if you've got questions on how I did some of this stuff, please don't hesitate to put those questions in the GoToWebinar panel there. I'll get to them after the presentation. So I've got a button up here at top that says the webinar will begin at 8:05. If I click that, I'm going to hide my icon there that gives you tells you basically that you're in the right place. So today, our goal is, of course, always to be relevant, timely, and give you real solutions. And we are going to first start off with our quick advertisement, because one of the reasons why we do this is to get the word out who we are, and we're here to help you more than anything. We do have a community site, InfoPath Dev, and we get a lot of people there. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to get free support there. We also provide ASAP support for people who want to get unblocked fast, and you can go to our website, Qdabra.com, and you'll get this form. We'll be sending you this form as part of the package today for free for attending the webinar and filling out the survey form. And so you'll be able to click on these links. We do training. We also do projects. And if you need a quick fix, we've got tools and templates to accelerate your project. Obviously, we have some really cool services that will help you scale your solution to beyond SharePoint. SharePoint limits anywhere from 5 to 50,000 entries. So if you want to go to 1 million and you need to store your data in SQL, we have a solution for you there. In addition, nowadays, people have a little bit of InfoPath anxiety, where you're not the only one, because of Microsoft's announcement in late January of this year that they were discontinuing future features of InfoPath. I am happy to say they are continuing to make updates, and they will for many, many years. But if you've got concerns, we've created a new website which we'll be revising here shortly in the next month. We have we have a matrix of different solutions that you can take a look at. We also have a free version of InfoPath successor for the browser. We hope to give to you and allow you to continue the solutions that you already have in place without having to migrate. Okay, so today what we're shooting for is the following. I want to talk about data source best practices, and then we're going to show us a quick example of how to copy data. There's 2 techniques. We'll show a change history example. This is a best practice because you want to keep track of what happened to your form. We'll then talk about uniquely identifying your form and show a quick, easy way to do that, and talk about another way to do it, and explain why SharePoint list IDs are not the right way to do it. And then we'll talk about using buttons to save and submit, and we'll finish off with a quick tip on how to integrate your InfoPath buttons and your status with SharePoint workflows. So some pretty simple stuff today. You can see that my form here has tabs in it. So this form, you're going to get this sample form as part of the kit today. We did actually present this about a year and a half ago. I used the same sample form, which is data-driven. So these tabs actually are coming from a separate data source. And we have these, of course, arrows here. I've just kind of thrown this form together. And I want to show you what it looks like in the Designer. So here's the form in the Designer. You can see that I have this all in one view, and the sections are basically just being hidden or shown based on what tab I'm on. So if we look at the rules here on the right, you can see that I've got a hide section for the, if I go down here to my data source one, we're going to talk about the data source. We've got a few bonus tidbits here in the data source section here, but what I want to talk about is the actual data source first, because that's the tip today. The tip is make sure that your data source is well structured and that the groups are well named. So you can see here on the right where I have my fields underneath my main data source. I've named my form to be QSample 2014-0619. Most of you, actually some of you, may not have realized that you can just double-click the field there, My Fields, and you can change the name. And that's a best practice to basically identify the form that you have. The data source is really key. It's kind of like your file cabinet. If you don't have a file cabinet that's well organized, you've got papers heaped on your desk, and it's a complete mess. It's hard to manage. So we want to group these different fields or files, or well, they're fields actually, into different folders, and that's why we use the folder icon here for the group. Now you can see that most of my groups are simply for sections that don't have fields, but underneath data source I've got a due date, a start date, end date, date diff, and so on. And then we've got a repeating structure here, holiday, underneath holidays. So what this little sample is going to do is it's going to actually calculate the difference between two dates, and it's going to exclude the holidays. Well, that's not the purpose of this tip. The tip is, hey, you've got a data source, make sure you've got well-named fields, make sure they're grouped accordingly, make sure your repeating groups are within non-repeating parents that are not the root node. Those are the tips. But just for kicks, we thought we'd add a little bit of extra functionality here and show you that it's very easy to set up a field with some formatting such that when you select a date, if it's within the orange threshold, it'll be orange. If it's outside of it, say they wanted to select a date for 7/3, then that's going to be yellow. And if they went further afield and selected something that was more than 30 days out, it would be green. And we can quickly do that conditional formatting using these simple rules in InfoPath. And if we look here, we've got these 3 formatting rules on the right. Once again, you're going to be able to open up the form and look at this yourself. So we're using some clever techniques to calculate the difference between these days and to highlight them based on whether or not they meet those conditions. You can look at that later. Once again, not the purpose for the demo. The purpose of the demo is to talk about data source best practices. And really, if you have data, if you have fields that you are trying to use to calculate, I don't know, calculate some value that will not persist with your form. For example, let's say we have status. So in my view info secondary data source over here on the right, I have a bunch of show hides in here, and I have show hides for the current tab. So the current tab that I'm on is what's going to show up here in preview. So if I'm on, and once again, if I click on one of these tabs, you can see that the tabs don't have labels in the designer because those labels are being pulled in from a secondary data source. But if I click on one of these tabs, you can see that we're setting the tab when we click on it. And we're using that rule, current tab equals 1, very simple. And in the preview mode, you'll see if I go back to welcome or Qdabra add here, you can see that that tab now gets highlighted. And how we did this was we're using a secondary data source. And this is a best practice for data sources because we're not polluting the main data source. So anything that the main data source, anything that your form doesn't really need to persist should go in a secondary data source. And we typically call these things view info or form info. And it's very easy to create these because InfoPath is so good at reading and writing XML. You can simply create a form in InfoPath Designer, and this is, you can call this your config form, and then you can add, basically over here you're going to call this form info, and you can add your status, your current status. Well, current status you might want to persist, but current tab, for example, you can put that just over here, and then you can actually preview this and save the XML out as an XML file, and then you can include it in your form. So let's see how we did that. So in data, underneath data connections, I have view info, and that's actually from my resource files. So I actually included view info in my resource files. Let's take a look at what view info looks like. So view info, you're going to get view info. I have a form that actually modifies view info. So in my view info secondary data source, I have, look at on the right here, the fields look remarkably similar to what we saw in the secondary data source in InfoPath. So here it's in the main data source. If I switch back to my form and switch to that secondary data source, you can see it's the same exact structure. as what you see here. So these are the values that I don't need to persist in the form, so why put them in the main data source? I want to use the secondary data source to set the values. And so the way I do that is I create a secondary data source using InfoPath Designer, save the preview, and then I come in here to resource files and I add it as a resource. Just browse out to it, add the view info XML file, and then and let's just take a look at how we did that. So in the preview here, it's previewing it. Now this has got some information in here that from a previous webinar that the tabs are, that is. So if I want to change the tabs, I just have to go into File Preview and say that I want to open the form I just saved for the actual today's demo, and that's View Info. And now if I preview it, you'll see that I have the tabs for today's webinar, and I can go in here and I can change this to say something like yo for welcome screen, and then I'll just save this out. I'll just save over the XML file there, and then I go back to my main form and I want to include it. So I go to my data source, actually I just go to Data Connections, Modify, click on the resource files, I click Add. I'm going to re-add View Info, replace the existing one, and click Next, Finish. Okay, now when I preview it, let me close the other preview. I think I have it open. Close that. We'll preview it again, and you'll see that that first tab now has become Yo. So that's kind of how we make these data-driven tabs, and that's a great example of a data source that we don't want to include those fields, what the current tab is, in the main data source. So that's the takeaway there, is if you've got a lot of values that you don't necessarily need to persist in your form, put those in the secondary data source, which you can design with InfoPath, and you just include it as a resource file. So here's another little tidbit, a little bonus tidbit here for us. Once again, calculating dates. Sometimes you want to calculate the date, the time between dates, and here you can see today's the 19th, and we want to calculate the date from today to July 6th. If we calculate it with just for the work days, you can see we've got 11. 1, 19, 20, and 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, the 30th, the 1st, the 2nd, and Thursday, the 3rd. So that's exactly 11 work days. To calculate the total number of days, I use a different technique, and I'm just calculating it based on the calendar. But sometimes we want to know what the work days are. And to do that, we have to exclude holidays, the 4th, and we have to exclude weekends. And so we have a quick command in here that you can reuse using QRules to do that date diff calculation. Okay, moving right along, let's talk about copying data. So why do you need to copy data into your form? Well, to state it plainly, you want your forms to be data-driven, kind of like you see with these tabs here on top. So you saw that it was very easy to change the tabs just by changing that secondary data file. And that makes the form easy to change, which means lower maintenance cost. And that's good because data-driven design is flexible and it allows for us to change things as our requirements change without incurring a lot of republish cost or design cost. But if you're going to do data-driven design, typically it involves copying data. When there's repeating data, it involves copying that data into your form. And here we're not copying data for our tabs because we're not persisting that in the form. But let's say you had another form. I'm just going to switch to my other sample here. See if I can find it. So I have this sample, and I've done this demo before. Some of you may have seen this in a previous webinar. But I've got a sample form here. It kind of explains what it does, so you can read this if you have time. But we have a secondary data source. We're actually filling the secondary data source in using default values. And I think you can see here we've got 5 rows that we're using for the main data source. Those are the default values. The secondary data source, you can't see what the default values are, but it's got three columns, actually has 4 columns, and I think it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We could, of course, go into our resource files and we could export it and we could modify it, but we'll just preview it and show you what the data is. So here the secondary data source has these 3 rows in it, and we want to copy some of that data. Typically what you would do is you'd have a drop down and you'd select, like for example, some kind of a region, and you would want to copy in all the buildings in that region. Or you might have a drop-down that selects a user or selects an account, and then you want to copy multiple pieces of information into your main form to reference that. In this case, we're just showing you how to copy repeating data, and there are two techniques. One of the techniques doesn't require anything. It's totally out of the box. And this technique basically uses the fact that when you have a table, if you set a column equal to a value, it will set everything, all rows, equal to that value. So the first technique is doing that. It's setting all rows in this main data source for underneath A column equal to, I think, space. When it does that, because it's setting all of the rows, and we have 5, it will trigger a rule for every single row, which will allow us to copy data from a secondary data source, because every time that rule triggers, we can go fetch the next row. And the way we do that is by using a counter. So let's just copy them in, and there you see they're copied. Now if I don't have the rows, let's say I only have, let me just delete the rows here and just add one row. If I only have one row, then it's only going to copy one row from the secondary data source. And this is the limitation with this approach, is it requires this secondary data source, it requires the main data source actually have default rows. And once again, the way you do that is in the designer, you can go into default values. You can see here that I've got 5 default rows, my main data source. If I want to add a 6th one, I just do that and then preview it. And you can see now I have 6 main data source rows, which is enough to copy those 3 rows from my secondary data source. No, not a problem. But if you've got a lot of rows and you want to copy, this is not a great technique, and you want to use technique number 2, which uses our QRoles plugin to copy. And the way it does that is it actually inserts the number of rows needed, and then using the insert, same thing, it's going to trigger a rule for each row, and then it's going to automatically copy it in. Let's see how we did that. So in the button here, the first button, what is it doing? We have a rule on the button that is setting that first column, and this is column A. It's setting it equal to a space. You can't see the space, but trust me, it's there. What that does then is it triggers a rule on column A. Here's the rule for approach number 1 that will go through and iteratively, loop through and copy all the values. And the way it does that is by using this counter. And every time it copies one row, it increments to the next row, and it's using that counter in the filter to set the values. You can see here there's the filter ID equals count. So as we iterate through it, we're just incrementing the count, we're just copying them through. That's really neat because you don't need QRoles to do that. The other technique, though, where you don't, but you do need default values, so you need default rows, and sometimes you don't know exactly how many you need. So the second approach then, I think I moved the buttons around by mistake, but the second approach, essentially it inserts the rows, and then when those rows are inserted, we're also going to get an event firing, but it's going to be on the actual row. So here you see approach number 2, and it's going to copy it in essentially the same way. The difference is that we insert the rows programmatically. So if you've got questions, please don't hesitate to throw those in the question area on the right. It looks like we have a few questions. And Stacy, we will provide a kit. We're going to send you a package at the end of the day that has this form in it, along with a couple other forms. And we'll include the copy data source sample in the kit, Josh. So don't worry about that. We'll have that in there for you. Okay, so that's a very, very common technique. Like I said, you're going to be copying data from secondary data sources, and the reason for that is because you want to make your forms data-driven. So you can use those 2 techniques to do that. Okay, let's take a look at change history. So change history is something that I highly recommend that you add to your form. In fact, we use this a lot, and we've actually created an XML template part for this, which I'm going to include that template part in the training today. I need to add it to my package here. But if we look at the designer, what I've done is I've actually added the template part here, the change history template part, to the design of my form. And you can see that when I add the template part, I don't know if you can see this, but in this light shade of gray text here, it says template part, change history. So we've actually designed a template part for you that allows us to do this. Now I'm going to, since I've already added to this form, I don't want to add it again. But what I want to do is just show you, if I were to create a new form, what it would look like if I add it to that form. So template parts are a great technique for these simple controls because they reduce your time. You create it once, and then you can reuse it in all your forms. So here I've got a template part that automatically, that not only does it add the fields to my data source on the right, but it also adds the view information, and it adds any data connections or rules as well. So it's a really nice expedient here. Now it doesn't work for everything, so there are a few catches here. So one of the catches is that sometimes it will break the rules. In this case, we have a condition here. We cannot include the preceding sibling calculation here for whatever reason. It doesn't transfer over. So we have a little note to ourselves to fix it up after the fact. And so we'll do that here. We'll just fix this guy up. Preceding sibling, this technique is used to count the number of fields in your form. And here what we're doing is we're just saying, it counts the number of rows. We're just saying, I want to, if we're on the last row, then we want to hide everything except for the last row, this blank. So we just made that change here. So now what we'll do is we'll preview this sample with this change history XML template part in it. Preview. And if I add a comment, now what you would want to do is you wouldn't want to have a drop down in your form. You're going to set the status, and maybe you let the user add comments, and then they'll click Save, Submit, or some other button in your form. And when they do that, you're going to then copy it into this. It's actually using the same table for both of these operations. So every time they make a change to the form, you're essentially going to be using this command that's underneath the Save button to set the value so that you can have this history in your form. And there you see it. So you can see the date timestamp is recorded with my username. How did we do it? So the Save button, and actually I'm going to show you in this form because this is what you're going to get. The Save button actually has a rule, and it's just going to set the user date and time. And when it does that, it's automatically going to show up down below because we have a rule on this repeating table here that hides all of the blank rows. And if we look at the data source, the default values, you can see that the change history has like 20 different rows in it. So out of the box, it has to have all those default values because, once again, we're incrementally adding rows with the current action, the current status, the date, time. We can't insert programmatically unless we have Q rules, and we don't want to use Q rules in this case because some of you may not have Q rules. So we're using this technique to just simply set the value of the last row. And the way we do that is by setting the username. It actually just sets the username for, let's see here. Yeah, it's just setting the username. It's only showing us the last row here in this. So you can see that both of these tables are bound to the same table, the history table. Because it's only showing us the last blank row, when we set it with the Save button, it sets the correct row. And that's how that works. Any questions, let me know. I'm going to just clear my voice here for a second. One sec. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so that was change history. Now let's take a look at the next tip. So once again, you can do this programmatically by using default values and by automatically setting the rows in your table, and then you'll get this nice little table with these values, and you can use this table to then do calculations. You can do date-time calculation to see, the date diff between 6/19 and 7/6 is 17 days, right? Well, if they didn't approve it for more than 10 days, maybe you want to flag that. You want to say, hey, this process isn't working. This person is not approving their forms quickly enough. So you can use that information in that table to do calculations and spot forms that have gone amiss. Okay, let's talk about form IDs. So this is the next tip. And form IDs are very useful. Obviously, you need to keep track of your forms, and so you need to create unique names for them. And we call this identification, form IDs, right? Two techniques stand out. natural keys using username and the time. And here you can see that I've actually just done this. In my box down below, I've actually concatenated my username with the date, the time, so there's 6:19, and it's 8:16, 47 seconds past the minute there. And if I re-preview the form, it'll show something different since I've been previewing this for about 14 minutes now, so I'm a little behind. But the way you do that is with that now function, and you want to remove the dashes, the other symbols that are included in the date and time. And the way we do that is, let me just switch, go down to form. Here we have natural key, and we're just using this translate function here to remove the T, the colon, and the dash from the date time. Now generates a date time string. We want to remove the special formatting characters from that string. And the way we do that is we just translate all those characters into nothing. That's what this second one is. And then it just removes it. And that gives us a nice ID for the form, which is relatively unique to the second, which is good enough for most people. Now, the other way you can do it is you can use a globally unique ID, which is a GUID. And the way we do that is we use Q rules to, let's just add a globally unique ID here. I'm running out of time. I'm going to speed up for a second here. I'm almost done. The globally unique ID, then, we want to set it. We want to add a, well, we can do it on load, so we can actually set it when the form loads. Assuming that the Q rules is still functioning here, we would we'd have a command that sets the value for Q rules command equal to, so you may know this already, but it's just generate GUID. That's globally unique ID. And then we also have to then copy the results. So we're going to set the value in my main data source where I have that GUID equal to the result from the QRules command. And that's right there. So let's see if this works here. We're going to preview this again. Let me close my previous preview. And we're going to drag that guy over. Now, if you want to add your fields to your form, and you don't necessarily want people to enter the data, you can right-click these fields and you can use more and choose calculated value. And that's going to give you a box that is read-only. And then you can go in here and you can reformat this just like you would a field. And we can change the coloring and everything. I just want to call this out so you can see it here. So let's preview this again. And hopefully without any problems, we'll see that that form ID is that global unique ID. So you see, we just created that unique ID, and every time I preview it, it'll be something different. So if I preview it again, you'll see that that unique ID changes. Now it's something different. Okay, so that's unique IDs. So you don't want to use the SharePoint ID. The reason for that is that those IDs will not migrate. So if you have a form in SharePoint and you're using, there's a technique that someone in actually SYM Wangaton talks about in one of her cookbooks. She does a great job in these cookbooks. But one of the techniques that she talks about, this max ID, will not work for you because if two people submit at the same time, it will overwrite the first person. So you don't want to use the max ID technique unless you're submitting twice, which is kind of involved. It requires a query. Just don't do it. It's not needed. You can use a natural key. It works just fine. And you don't necessarily need to use, if you want like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing, you can still use the max ID, but just make sure you do it twice. So you want to submit the form, then you want to query the ID and set it in your form. So in other words, you're not setting the form equal to the max ID before you submit it. You're submitting it first, you're requerying for that form, and you have to use a natural key to do that, and then you're getting the ID from SharePoint. But those IDs will not migrate, so you're going to have something in your form that is unique anyway. Okay, so we're almost done. So last demo then is the save and submit. Save and submit, obviously, people want to save their forms. It's pretty critical. Out of the box, InfoPath gives you these save and submit options here, whether you're in the browser or the filler. You want to be unchecking these. So in the form options, go in here and uncheck save and submit. You do not want users to use the save and submit in the ribbon. The reason for that is that they will save it as some strange file name, and they'll put it in some weird location, or they might overwrite an existing file. You want to control where they save it and what the name is, and to enforce consistency. So you're going to use save and submit as buttons in your form. So we have an example that we'll include here, not this one. Let's see if I can find it here quickly. We're running out of time. Okay, so the view info, you're going to get this one as well. And I know I have it open here. Okay, so here is the form, save and submit. So save and submit here, basically we just want to save it to a SharePoint library. So we have our library connection. That's a no-brainer, right? And then what save does is the same as submit. So we're using a submit button to actually save the form. How do we do that? Well, if we look at the manage rules over here, we're just setting the status equal to save, and then we're just using the default submit form data connection. And so when we submit it, we just change it to be set the status equal to submitted, and then submit the form and close it. So we're just using a status field to control whether it's in a save state or a submit state. And then we want to use that status field to move the form, for example, from one library to another, or to maybe remove permissions using a SharePoint workflow. The way we do that is in form options, we have this thing called promoted properties. And we can add that field status to our promoted properties. And when we do that, the SharePoint workflow will have access to it. And we can use it in our condition at the very top of our workflow step to say, hey, if the status equals submitted, please remove the read-write permissions so that only managers can now approve it, right? Or if the status equals submitted, please move this form, copy it from this library to another library which has those permissions on it. So that's pretty much the technique. It's fairly straightforward. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, what if you have a required field in your form? Because you can't submit a form if it has a field that has been filled out. So like, let's say you have a field here that is required. Obviously, if we try to submit it, it's going to say, hey, can't do it. You haven't filled out the form. There's a validation error because the name is not filled out. But actually, we can do it, and the way we do that is by using, oops, I've got a bug in my form. When I try to hit submit first, we can use save to do it. Actually, there's still a bug in here. But the way we do it, let me just show you in the designer since we're running out of time. The way we do it is we call clear errors. So QRules has a clear errors command that will clear all the validation errors. Or you can just make the field not required, and then you don't need QRules. But the best practice is to use the buttons for the save and submit. And go back to my preview. Once again, that's to enforce the consistency. It also is great for workflow because you can position those buttons in your form exactly where it makes sense. And you'll want to then tie them to the workflow by setting that promoted property so the workflow condition can actually reference the status and do what you want. So that's pretty much it for the demos. And now I'm here to answer any questions you have on InfoPath. And let's see, we have 3 questions. Actually, I've already answered 2 of them. So if you have questions on InfoPath on anything, please enter them now. We are recording, so we'll post this on YouTube. And we do have a survey we'd like you to fill out. It's just short; it should only take a minute. And then we'll send you the kit later today. So Stacey's got one more question. Does doing the tabs this way avoid needing to view the form in compatibility mode in the browser? Let's see, in compatibility mode in the browser. I guess what you're saying is that the new version of Internet Explorer doesn't let you, I'm trying to figure out what your issue is with the tabs. I haven't published this to the browser, but these are just buttons. So these should show up just fine in the browser. And you can see how we did this. It's really kind of silly, but it works really well, and it's simple. So we have these buttons. Basically what I do is I just create these buttons for each one, and I just copy them, right? So I got a slightly bigger button for the one it's on, and you can see here we have rules for each one, and we just copy the rules from each button to show them based on where we're at. We have this current tab, like I said, the current tab in the secondary data source we're using to identify which button we're on. So it's a pretty clever technique, and it's very simple to do. And like I said, you'll get the sample form so you can take a look at it. But these look just fine. You know, you're selecting through these, and they'll work just fine in the browser, even if you have IE24 or whatever version you're on. I don't know about IE24, but IE11 will work fine. So any other questions for me? Let's see here. Yes, we have one more question. And Stacey, I have forms with tab buttons, and it changes views. It is not compatible with the new IE, but works in compatibility mode. Right. Well, I'll have to check on that and get back to you. But those buttons should be working. We use buttons in our browser forms all the time, and we're using IE 11, and we don't have to go into compatibility mode for those. So it may be something in your form. Feel free to send your form, and we'll take a quick look. You can send your form to support@qdabra.com, and we can take a quick look at it. Caitlin has a question. We want to be able to post a form through a browser so we can use the form externally. Is this free in InfoPath? No, it's not. In order to make the form available to external people, you will need to purchase SharePoint Enterprise, which you may already have. If you have SharePoint Enterprise, then you have access to InfoPath Form Services, and you can provide an extranet form for them to fill out, and you can anonymously then submit it back to your SharePoint library. And the way you do that is by sending an email to that SharePoint library. You can configure email to that SharePoint library, and then you can send the form to the library as an anonymous user, because those external users probably will not be authenticated. And that's something that we can help you with. We've done that for other customers. The other technique is to have them install the filler and use that, but most people out in the field that are not in your organization, they may not have InfoPath filler. We do have, like I said, that Forms Viewer product coming out, and we have version 1 actually we're launching in a few weeks here. Formsquo.com is our new site, and we have on here a list of all the different technologies that you might be looking to migrate to, including one that doesn't require migration, and that's called Forms Viewer. And so we have version 1 coming out here in a few weeks. With the free download, you'll be able to use that. If you have SharePoint 2013 Foundation, or if you have SharePoint 2013 in the cloud, it will install an app, and you can use the app to view your forms in SharePoint. You will still need to set up the external network so your external users can access it, but it will work. There are a few things that are not included yet, so like InfoPath Form Services V1, we don't have support for things like file attachments or rich text, but we do have support for a wide range of controls. And you can go to our website and find out what's supported. I think if you click on the free download here, it'll show you what the versions include. And so this is slightly out of date. We just did finish feature complete here. We're not including rich text for V1, even though it says we are here. We just couldn't get it done in time. So we're going to target V1.1 September for that. But everything else we got done. So we're very happy about that. We hope that, that you take a look at that site. We're going to be updating the website with new content here in a couple weeks. So that's pretty much it for my webinar, and I want to thank you again for joining us today. Fill out the survey. We'll send you what you saw, and if you have any questions whatsoever, don't be shy. Feel free to contact us at InfoPathDev or send email to support@qdabra.com or send email to webinars@qdabra.com. We're here for you. We got your back. Hope you have a great day.